Hey guys, Moms Against Medical Bullying. I just wanted to share something real quick. So, this is Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus United States. So, in this says it was a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court holding that the Commerce Clause gave the U.S. Congress power to force private businesses to abide by Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in public accommodations. So that's interesting because why is the word on the block that you can't force businesses, that businesses can do what they want? Apparently they can't. They have to abide by this Title II of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in public accommodations. So, let's see, 1964. Let's see. The petitioner's argument. So let's see what this guy's argument was. He said the Heart of Atlanta Motel was a large 216-room motel that opened on September 5th, 1956 in Atlanta, Georgia, in direct violation of the terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial discrimination in public places, largely based on Congress's control of interstate commerce. That's interesting. That's I don't know if I'm interpreting this wrong or not, but basically doesn't seem like they banned it because it was wrong or something. It says it was which banned racial discrimination in public places largely, okay, so it's largely based on Congress's control of interstate commerce. The motel refused to rent rooms to African American patrons. The owner, Morton Rolston, filed suit in federal court arguing that the requirements of the act exceeded the authority the Commerce Clause granted to Congress over interstate commerce. Rolston specifically argued against Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or national origin in places of public accommodation. And I just want to pause and say that just because medical isn't in there doesn't mean that we can't win, because, we have a new problem now, because they've developed a new type of segregation. So it says hotels and motels are included as types of public accommodation in the act, and so are restaurants that serve food substantially to those who participate in interstate travel. In further arguing against the validity of the Act's basis on the Commerce Clause, he stated that people themselves are not commerce. Rather, people engage in commerce. Therefore, a hotel or motel does not necessarily engage in interstate commerce because the profit comes from persons rather than goods. Rolston also asserted that racial discrimination by an individual is not prohibited by the 14th Amendment or the Constitution, claiming that discrimination is a private wrong that individuals are allowed to commit. So, this guy's take, is the take that a lot of people are saying these days. Like, I'm a private business and I can serve who I want to serve, and I can get rid of who I want to get rid of. In addition, Rolston maintained that it violated his Fifth Amendment rights to choose customers and to operate his business as he wished, and resulted in unjust deprivation of his property without due process of law and just compensation. Finally, he contended that Congress had placed him in a position of involuntary servitude by forcing him to rent available rooms to African Americans, thereby violating his 13th Amendment rights. Rolston noted that in 1944, the Fifth Circuit of Appeals for the United States held that even if acts committed in involuntary servitude are compensated, it still violates the 13th Amendment. Rolston maintained throughout his argument that the Constitution should be interpreted as it was, at the time of its creation and as the framers originally intended. He concluded his opening argument by stating the Supreme Court did not need to exist if the Commerce Clause allowed for Congress to enact any regulations it pleases. So, the respondent's argument. In response, Archibald Cox, the Solicitor General for the United States, countered that the restrictions requiring adequate accommodation for African Americans were unquestionably related to interstate travel, and that Congress, under the Constitution's Commerce Clause, certainly had the power to address such a matter in law. Cox stated that racial discrimination in inns and restaurants constitutes a source of burden or obstruction to interstate commerce. He brought up multiple examples in which protests over racial discrimination, some in regards to public accommodations and some with broader scopes, intensely affected the economy of certain areas. One of the prime examples was Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963, during which department and downtown stores sales dropped dramatically in the area, and the amount of business failure rivaled the rates of the Great Depression. Cox also mentioned that the areas that do not practice equal opportunity are often overlooked by companies that seek commercial and industrial expansion due to the possibility of demonstrations. He used Little Rock, Arkansas to exemplify this point, as business's expansion fell by over $50 million in the 2 years it experienced high racial tensions. So, am I reading this right? Basically, their argument is money. When people engage in segregation and discrimination, it causes it interrupts the commerce. Cox also highlighted how discrimination by hotels and motels hinders interstate travel by limiting the availability of accommodations for travelers. He described the impediment discrimination imposes with a hypothetical road trip. On a motor trip between Washington, D.C. and Miami, Florida, the average distance that was found between accommodations of reasonable quality open to Negroes was 141 miles. And when we think of the frequency by such we go by other hotels and motels open to everyone, the significance of a 3 or 4 hour drive between the hope of accommodation is very significant indeed. He further argued that the Fifth Amendment does not forbid reasonable regulation of interstate commerce, and that such incidental damage did not constitute the taking of property without just compensation or due process of law. He emphasized that the courts have consistently sustained cases that strengthen anti-discrimination measures. Lastly, he asserted that the 13th Amendment applies primarily to slavery and the removal of widespread disabilities associated with it, and so it undoubtedly would not place issues of racial discrimination and public accommodations beyond the reach of federal and state law. But surely it would turn the world quite upside down for anyone to seriously suggest that the 13th Amendment was intended to prohibit either Congress or the state governments from guaranteeing Negroes equality of treatment in places of public accommodation. So, the ruling. The United States District Court for Northern District of Georgia ruled in favor of the United States and issued a permanent injunction requiring the Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. to refrain from using racial discrimination when providing services, goods to guests or the general public on its premises. The case was combined with the case of the future governor of Georgia, Lester Maddox, regarding his Pickwick restaurant and his refusal to serve African Americans. Interesting. The U.S. Supreme Court held that Congress acted well within its authority under the Commerce Clause in passing Civil Rights Act of 1964, thereby upholding the Act's Title II in question. While it might have been possible for Congress to pursue other methods for abolishing racial discrimination, the way in which Congress did so, according to the court, was perfectly valid. It found no merit in the arguments pursuant to the 13th Amendment, finding it difficult to conceive that such an amendment might be applicable in restraining civil rights legislation. Having observed that 75% of the Heart of Atlanta Motel's clientele came from out of state and that it was strategically located near Interstate 75 and 85, as well as two major Georgia highways, the court found that the business clearly affected interstate commerce. Accordingly, it upheld the permanent injunction issued by the district court and required the Heart of Atlanta Motel to receive business from clientele of all ethnicities. So this is interesting. Oh, edited 2 days ago. I know Wikipedia is probably not a really good source, but for what it's worth, that's interesting. The whole thing about the Commerce Clause. So basically, yeah, they did it for the economy, it seems like, was their main argument. And, I think hotels are doing the same thing with masks, too. So wouldn't that be a valid argument against mask segregation? Whatever, this is a different type of segregation we're dealing with. So, lawyers might need to get creative with their arguments. Since this is new ground that we're treading on, this whole medical religion, crazy mass discrimination.